Hi, it's Dr. Parikh. So we talked about what a literature review is. Now let's talk about what makes a research proposal. So we're still in Blackboard. We'll follow the same steps under writing resources, templates, and examples. And the first link here goes to sample papers, and they're set into folders that have both a literature review and a research proposal. Remember, the first folder has a bunch of just literature reviews, but the rest have a matched set. So we were looking at the Helping Family Members with Schizophrenia paper, and I've got them pulled up already. So here we're in the literature review, and the easiest way to see how the research proposal and literature review compare is to see them side by side. So I'm going to cover my face up so that I can have both papers side by side here for you. So you can see the running head, the format is the same. The author made slight changes to the running head and made the article title a bit more specific to focus more on the research question. So a research proposal adds in a research question. So instead of just telling you about a topic, it's talking about a proposed study. Now, research proposals are kind of an academic type of paper. You don't typically see them published in journal articles. Usually what's published in journals is finished studies. But when you, for example, if you're doing a thesis or dissertation, you will often do a proposal first. So you'll propose your study, your faculty will look at it and decide whether it is, good enough and doable and realistic. So we'll usually give you some feedback and we'll then approve it. And then you do the study and write up your thesis or dissertation. Sometimes for grant proposals, you may include a research proposal so that the funding body can decide whether the study is appropriate and worth funding. So the research proposal, it's a skill more for academia, but it works well for a lot of classes because it gives you a way to talk about topics in a more research-focused way without having to actually go out and do the study. So when you're doing a proposal, that means you're not pretending that you got the data. You are saying, this is a study I would like to do, that I am proposing to do. So we look down, and still the first thing after the title page is the abstract. It's still going to be the last thing you write for your paper. You'll notice these two papers share a lot, especially from the literature review section, which is now called the introduction. But there's also a lot that you rewrite. So the topic is going to be the same, but in some ways it's all one big paper, but in other ways you really are writing two distinct papers. So you'll notice, for example, for the abstract, the first sentence of the literature review is, I think, exactly the same as the first sentence for the research proposal. After that, things start to get very different because the research proposal abstract is focused on the proposal itself. And the keywords, it looks like they were slightly updated, the keywords. All right, so we go down to the first page of the main body of the paper, and we have, and actually, I just realized this person forgot to update. So this person updated the title on the title page, but the title here at the beginning of the paper is still the same. So if I noticed that when I graded, there was a small ding for inconsistency. And again, you'll notice the very beginning is similar, but pretty quickly the focus shifts because now your roadmap paragraph, which is still this kind of academic paragraph that's orienting you to the overall layout of the paper, that's usually not in published journal articles. This roadmap paragraph is now, instead of focusing on a thesis, focusing on the purpose and hypothesis of the study. So you see this study offers insights, blah, blah, blah. It is hypothesized that, blah, blah, blah. So the focus is shifted. Even though the topic is the same, the focus is different. You'll also see the heading under that roadmap paragraph used to be literature review. Now it's introduction. That's the term that's much more common when we're talking about a research-oriented article. We still have a background paragraph, and if you look, it's a little tweaked, but it's fairly similar. You'll see most of the articles in the sample paper folder, the literature review or introduction are similar. That's because usually those authors did a really good job the first time. There's a couple papers that I have up as samples where there's a big difference, And you'll notice it's a really big improvement. And in that case, I typically wouldn't have chosen the literature review for a sample paper, but I really like being able to highlight for students how much work can go into that transition from one to the other. So here you'll see the background paragraph stays fairly similar, but I mean, you will get a lot of feedback on your literature review, so you will have opportunities to make it better for the final paper. And I do, when I'm grading the final paper, I look at them side by side, and and if I notice that nothing has changed, I will just look at what the rubrics are similar for this section, so I'll just look at what I graded you the first time and grade the same thing. If you didn't spend time revising, I'm not going to spend time regrading. This person did tweak one of the titles from United at Home Approach to Empathy and Emotions, and I'm not sure if the author just wanted to improve it or if that's something that I gave feedback about. So that section stays pretty similar, and that's usually the section that took the most work to write in the literature review, so it's nice that section, you're still revising it, but you're not really rewriting it per se. Now, for the literature review, the discussion section comes directly after you finish talking about the literature. For a research proposal, first you have a new paragraph added on to your literature review called the present study. This paragraph, there's a very specific guideline for how to write this, so you'll see that template, but essentially you start with what was the main point of the literature you just reviewed, what's missing from the literature, and how can your study fill that gap. And then it introduces the purpose of the present study and your hypothesis, so what you predict is going to happen. So this paragraph is your transition from one part of your paper to the next. And usually if you're trying to find the purpose or the hypothesis of a research paper, usually looking right before the start of the methods section is your best bet. So I'll keep trying to distinguish what is standard and what is common and what is just my class. So having a paragraph right before the method that has this transition is very common, but there's no standard heading name. Now having a methods section, that is extremely standard. And having these subsections, participants, measures, and procedures, is very, very common. I tried to pick the most standard titles. You'll almost always see participants. Measures, sometimes you'll see materials or instruments or even apparatus used as the title of that. And procedure is, again, pretty common. Sometimes an author might combine participants and procedures, but I tried to pick kind of the most textbook layout here to teach. The participants section describes who's in the study. So at a minimum, you would expect to see how many people and gender and race and age. That's sort of the basic starting guidelines. But usually you'll see some more information, and it's going to vary by study, what's relevant for that study. Next up is measures. You'll see all the measures that are included. I try not to go too deep down the rabbit hole of experimental psychology when I'm teaching this class. But when you do a study, you don't just ask questions that seem like they would be interesting. Good research uses established measures that have already been tested to see if they measure what they say they measure and whether they get the same measurement each time. So if let's say that I'm measuring reading ability and I go with shoe size. Well, for ages, say 5 to 12, that might be a somewhat, I might get fairly decent results because as your feet get bigger, you tend to also have reading levels that go up. But that's not saying that foot size is actually a measure of reading level. It's just that for that subpopulation, as people get older, if they're getting education, they also tend to get better at reading. So I'm not really measuring reading level, I'm measuring age in a society that is educating on reading at the same time. So that's an extreme example, But in general, it's really easy to create measures that are bad. And so it takes a lot of effort to make sure that your measures are good. And for this study, I don't force you to create an amazing study. In fact, for the measures, often it's a little bit of a stretch because I have a group of measures put together for you already. I'll show you those when we get there. And I encourage you to choose one of those just because it's easier. Everything's there. Sometimes that means that it's not a measure that really makes sense in terms of your literature and what would be a logical question. I'm okay with that. I'm okay with overlooking sort of a weird fit of measure and topic. What I'm not okay with is letting you model bad science. So I require you to, excuse me, to use an established measure of some sort. And if you want to use a measure that's not in my list, I'm open to that, but you need to show me that you can find the basic information about the study. So how many items? What's a sample item? How people respond to it. And typically you would also report what's called Cronbach's alpha. By the time it's not here, but I may add it in because it's so standard. So even though you don't know what that means, I want you to know that there's this list of standard things you include. Then the procedures section explains what happens from first contact to last contact from the participant's perspective. If you've ever been part of one of those demos where they have you write down the instructions for making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich and then, watch while somebody tries to literally follow each direction, and if you say open the bag but don't say untwist the twist tie, the person just has to kind of rip the bag. The procedures, it's meant to be a scientific study. I should be able to replicate your study based on your write-up. So it should be a detailed description of what participants experience, including things like what order do they see the questions in? So, which measure do they do first? Do they do the demographics at the beginning or at the end? Things like that. And there's also ethical information that you include here. So things like specifying that there's informed consent, and I tell you what things to emphasize. Also that there's debriefing and that the data gets protected. So there's certain information that you'll put into the procedure section. After the method section, there's the results section where you say, typically this is where you would say what you found, and it would be longer than this. It's not a terribly long section usually, but longer than a paragraph. But in this case, you're not actually getting the data, so you're not actually analyzing it. Instead, you're just telling me how you would analyze it once you had it. You'll notice here the author made a mistake and the indent for this paragraph isn't quite as deep as it should be. It should be a nice 1/2 inch like it is down in the discussion section. And there's a lot of statistical terms. Again, you probably haven't taken stats yet, so they won't have a lot of meaning for you, but I want you to start paying attention to details. Like for t-test, the t gets italicized, but the test doesn't. Or the p in p-values is lowercase and italicized. So for the method and results, I tell you what needs to go in. And for the results, really, it's pretty standard language. I just tell you, you just have to be able to fill in your variables for the most part, and then pay attention to detail as you write it up. So now we're back to the discussion section. So we finally caught up with where our literature review is. And the first paragraph is still a summary paragraph, but it's different because now you're focused on what was the focus of this study, what was the hypothesis, and what would it mean if the hypothesis was supported. You have a second paragraph here that is this integration paragraph where you're looking at if the hypothesis is supported, so you're staying very hypothetical here, if it were supported, what might it mean? How would it fit with previous findings in the literature? And how does it fit with theory existing in the literature? Next, you would have limitations, and remember, this section has been updated to be limitations and future directions. So you'll now focus on your study. What are 3 limitations? And these are very simple studies because the focus isn't on teaching you how to design a study. The focus is on how to write up a study. So I try to keep the studies really, really basic, which means there's lots that's missing. There's lots to critique. And then you'll have a paragraph after that where you pick 2 of your critiques and you talk about what could be done differently in the future, so future directions. And then you'll have your professional applications paragraph where you talk about how two different professionals might use this, or how one professional might use this in two different ways. So both of these sections are going to be rewritten because your professional applications will focus now on, again, your hypothesis. If you do your study, how will people be able to use it? So the discussion section has most of the same sections, a little more information, but most of the content will need to be rewritten to be focused on your study. But it'll go much faster this time because you'll know what the section is looking for. And the newer sections, the methods and results, it's certainly work, but it's a lot more formulaic. You're really just kind of logically thinking, okay, there's a lot of small decisions to make, but it's not the kind of creative crafting that it takes to do the literature review section. Most of that you get to recycle from one paper to the next. And then last is your conclusions. It's your final chance to make an impression on the reader before they leave. So it's your take-home message, and you're trying to do it in a way that's interesting and relatable and memorable. So you're repeating some of the main themes, but you're trying to put a little more, a little different spin on it. And again, this section will mostly be rewritten because you're focused on your hypothesis and your study. After that is your references. Make sure that you've included everything that you have in your paper, and you'll also typically add at least one reference because you have a measure. And if you pick one of the measures that I have ready for you, I give you the reference. I tell you exactly what needs to go in there. That's your research proposal. So again, there's no real, at this point in summer 2019, I don't have any requirements for page minimum or maximum. When you're writing for academic, if you're writing for a class, there's often a minimum. But in this class, I find that students get freaked out and start filling lots of fluff, no matter how many times I tell them not to. And then if I have a minimum, I usually also have a maximum. And then students are mad because they're over the maximum, and I tell them I'm going to take off points. Because in the real world, if a grant application has a maximum, that's a very real limit. If a journal has a maximum, they only have so many pages to print if they're actually printing out like a magazine, which most journals still do. And so they're going to cut you off. So I want to focus on strong writing, which is often concise writing. And I just want to give you one less thing to manage. But these are about the lengths that most good papers end up being. Somewhere in the 7 to 9 range for the literature review, and somewhere in the, I would say, 11 to 15 range for the research proposal. This one, I think the methods section was pretty concise. Some other ones run a little longer than this. But I care more about you including the content than hitting a certain page number. So that's what you need to know about what a research proposal is, and when we get to those set parts of the semester, I'll go section by section to walk you through how to write it. Thanks. Bye.